The general made the mistake on a Tuesday morning in front of cameras. He called Muhammad Ali a coward in a room full of reporters and military brass and government officials who had all gathered to hear the weekly Department of Defense press briefing. He had been preparing the statement for 3 days. He had consulted with 2 colleagues about the wording. He had rehearsed it at least 4 times in his office the morning before the briefing. He had chosen every word with the specific calculated intention of ending the public conversation about Ali's draft refusal by reframing it in the most devastating terms available to a man of his rank and institutional authority. He called Ali a coward, and he said it loudly, and he said it with the full weight of his uniform and his 23 years of service behind it. And he expected that to be the end of it. A general had spoken. The matter was settled. It was not the end of it. What happened in the 11 days that followed removed the general from his position, created a formal congressional inquiry, and became one of the most studied examples in the following decades of how a single precisely constructed response to institutional power can dismantle not just the specific attack, but the authority that made the attack possible in the first place. The general was Brigadier General Franklin Morley. He was 51 years old and had served 23 years in the United States Army, with a record that the Army considered exemplary. He had fought in Korea as a young officer. He had served in Germany during the tensest years of the Cold War. He had been decorated 3 times and promoted steadily through the ranks, with the predictable momentum of a man who understood how institutions worked and how to navigate them successfully. Since 1964, he had served as Director of Public Affairs for the Department of Defense, which meant his specific assignment for the past 3 years had been to manage how the United States military presented itself to the American public during the most divisive and increasingly unpopular foreign military engagements the country had prosecuted in the 20th century. This was not a comfortable position to hold in September of 1967. The country was fracturing over Vietnam in ways that no amount of careful press management had been able to prevent. Protests were growing in scale and frequency, and the photographs of them were on front pages and television screens every day. Young men were burning draft cards publicly, and the imagery was spreading. Military recruitment was encountering resistance it had not previously experienced. The narrative that the Department of Defense needed the American public to believe, which was that the war was necessary and manageable and progressing as intended, was becoming harder to sustain with each passing month against the evidence that was accumulating on the ground in Southeast Asia and in the streets of American cities. Morley had become one of the primary public faces of the military's effort to maintain that narrative. He was good at it. He had the precise combination of credentials, bearing, and controlled intelligence that made him effective in front of cameras. He could answer difficult questions without appearing to evade them. He could project confidence about situations that were genuinely uncertain. He was, by the standards of his profession and his era, exactly the right person for the job he had been given. The specific context for the statement about Ali was a Department of Defense press briefing in Washington on a Tuesday morning in September 1967. The briefing was primarily about troop numbers and operational updates. At the end of it, a reporter asked about Muhammad Ali, whose draft refusal 4 months earlier had still not been resolved in the courts, and who was still actively speaking at college campuses across the country. The reporter asked whether the military had a response to Ali's claim that the war was morally wrong. Morley had been waiting for exactly this question. He had prepared for it. He looked directly at the cameras and he said that Muhammad Ali's refusal to serve was not a moral position, but a cowardly act by a man who was willing to take everything America had given him and unwilling to give anything back. He said Ali was a coward, hiding behind religion to avoid his duty. He said the men fighting in Vietnam were the brave ones, and Ali was demonstrating by his refusal exactly the kind of weakness that the enemies of America counted on. He said cowardice had many faces, and Muhammad Ali's face was one of them, The room was quiet for a moment after he said it. Then the reporters started writing. The statement reached Ali that afternoon through a telephone call from his attorney. Ali was in Chicago, preparing for a speaking engagement at Northwestern University scheduled for that evening. He listened to the full quote as his attorney read it from the wire service report. He did not respond immediately. He asked his attorney to read it again. Then he said he would call back within the hour. He called back in 40 minutes. He told his attorney what he wanted to say in response. His attorney, who had been practicing law for 20 years and who had a sophisticated understanding of how public statements worked and what they could cost, listened to the full response and said only that he wanted Ali to be certain. Ali said he was certain. The response was released through Ali's attorney to every wire service and every major newspaper that afternoon. By evening, it was on the radio. By the next morning, it was on the front page of newspapers in every major American city. What Ali said was this. He said he had heard that General Franklin Morley had called him a coward in a room full of reporters and cameras. He said he would like to respond to the general directly. He said a coward was a man who sent other men to die in a war while standing safely in a room in Washington giving press briefings. He said a coward was a man who had the power to stop a war and chose instead to manage the press coverage of it. He said he would like to ask General Morley how many times in his 23 years of military service he had personally stood between another human being and the thing that was trying to kill that human being. He said the men who were truly brave were not the generals giving press briefings in Washington. They were the young men who had been told they had no choice and had gone anyway. He said he had made a choice, and he was standing in front of the consequences of that choice every day, without a title, without a license, without income from his profession, under federal indictment. He said he would like the general to explain which part of that was cowardice and which part of a general's press briefing was bravery. Then he said the line that would be quoted for the next 50 years. He said that the only coward in this conversation was a man in a uniform who had never faced anything more dangerous than a reporter's question, standing in a safe room in Washington, calling names at a man who had given up everything for his belief. He said General Morley could call him whatever he wanted to call him, but he should do it from somewhere closer to the danger than a press briefing room in Washington, D.C. The response landed in the public conversation like a physical object. It was not rhetoric. It was not passion. It was a series of specific and verifiable statements arranged with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. Everything Ali said was checkable. Morley had spent the past 3 years in Washington. Morley had not served in a combat role since Korea. Morley's job was in fact press management. All of this was a matter of public record. Ali had not invented a characterization. He had described a documented reality and asked a question about it that had no good answer. The military's first response was silence. For a full 48 hours after Ali's statement was published in every major newspaper in America and read on every major radio network, the Department of Defense made no public statement in response. This silence was itself a statement of a kind, and the reporters who covered the military understood it immediately. The reporters who had been in the room on Tuesday when Morley called Ali a coward were now writing stories about why an institution that had been prompt and confident in making the accusation was now apparently unable to respond to the rebuttal. The stories were not favorable to the military's position. On the third day after Ali's statement, the Department of Defense issued a carefully worded brief public response. The response said that General Morley's comments at the Tuesday briefing had been made in his personal capacity and did not represent the official position of the Department of Defense on the subject of conscientious objection or draft refusal. The statement was 2 sentences, and it created an immediate and significant problem for the military. Morley had been speaking at an official Department of Defense press briefing. He had been identified in every wire service report by his full title and his official role. He had been standing at the official Department of Defense podium. Every reporter who had been in the room said so in their subsequent coverage, which appeared the same day as the Department of Defense's claim that his comments were personal. By the fifth day, 3 United States senators, all members of the Armed Services Committee, had sent formal, written letters to the Secretary of Defense requesting a detailed explanation of the circumstances. 2 of the letters specifically quoted entire sections of Ali's response about the distinction between generals who managed press briefings in Washington and soldiers who died in the Vietnamese jungle. One senator asked directly whether the Department of Defense endorsed the view that men who refused military service on grounds of religious conscience were cowards, and if not, what action the department intended to take regarding a general who had stated that view officially. The letters were made public by the senators' offices the same day they were sent. They appeared on front pages the following morning, alongside continuing coverage of the story. The Department of Defense was now not only managing the original exchange, but managing a congressional inquiry about the exchange, which required a different level of response and a different level of institutional accountability than a press briefing follow-up. By the 7th day, a Senate subcommittee had formally requested that the Department of Defense provide written clarification on 3 specific questions. First, whether Morley's characterization of religious draft objectors as cowards was or was not official military policy. Second, whether the Department of Defense stood behind the content of statements made by its officials at official press briefings or not. Third, what review processes existed to prevent future instances of military officials using official platforms to make characterizations of private citizens that were not sanctioned policy positions. Each of the 3 questions was answerable only in ways that created additional problems for the institution, regardless of which answer was given. By the 9th day, it was known within the defense establishment that General Morley had retained a private attorney. It was also known that the Department of Defense's Inspector General's office had opened an administrative review of the September Tuesday briefing and of the circumstances surrounding Morley's statement. Administrative reviews of this kind were not unusual in large bureaucratic organizations. An administrative review of a press briefing conducted by the Director of Public Affairs was unusual. It signaled to everyone within the institution who understood how these processes worked that the conclusion had already been determined, and the review was documentation for a decision that had been made. On the 11th day, Brigadier General Franklin Morley was relieved of his position as Director of Public Affairs for the Department of Defense and reassigned to an administrative role in a position that did not involve contact with the press or public statements on behalf of the military. The reassignment was announced in a brief internal memo. No official connection to the Ali exchange was made explicit in the announcement. Every reporter in Washington understood the connection immediately. The Department of Defense released a brief public statement saying the reassignment was part of a routine rotation of assignments. No reporter who had been covering the story for 11 days described it as routine. What Ali had done was understood differently by different observers across the days and months and years that followed the exchange. Military scholars who studied the episode in the 1970s and 1980s said that Ali had demonstrated a near instinctive understanding of how institutional authority depends on the appearance of being above personal reproach and above factual challenge. Morley had attacked Ali on moral grounds, characterizing Ali's position as cowardice. The natural response, the response that most people under that kind of attack would produce, was a moral counterargument, an assertion of courage, a defense of the position. But moral counterarguments against institutional authority tend to produce moral counter-counterarguments, and in those exchanges, the institution usually has the advantage because it has more resources, more platforms, and more credibility with the audiences that both sides are trying to reach. Ali had not produced a moral counterargument. He had produced a factual description of the person making the moral claim against him. He had identified Morley's location, his role, and his record, and he had asked questions about those facts that the facts themselves made unanswerable in any way that was favorable to Morley. He had shifted the conversation from the terrain where Morley was strong, which was the assertion of institutional authority and conventional definitions of patriotism, to the terrain where Morley was exposed, which was the specific question of what courage and cowardice actually looked like in the concrete daily reality of each man's life. The brilliance of the response, which was not accidental but was the product of years of thinking about exactly these questions, was that it contained no insult and no emotion visible enough to be identified and dismissed. Ali had not called Morley a coward. He had described Morley's documented situation and asked questions about it. The distinction was everything. A counter-insult gives the institution something to respond to and deflect with. A series of factual questions with no good answers gives the institution nothing to work with except the answers themselves. And the answers were the problem. Ali himself, in the years after the exchange, described what he had done in terms that were characteristically simple and characteristically precise. He said he had asked the question that was already in the room. He said everyone who had watched a general in Washington call a man with no job, no title, no license, and a federal indictment hanging over him a coward had a question forming somewhere in their mind about what the word meant and who it applied to. He said he had just asked it out loud. He said when the right question is already in the room, you don't need to do anything except be the one who asks it. Lawyers who studied the exchange in legal contexts said what Ali had produced in 40 minutes functioned structurally like a legal brief. It identified the specific claim made against him with precision, examined the credibility of the claimant relative to the subject matter of the claim, and posed questions that the claimant could not answer without undermining the credibility of the original claim. It required no anger to be effective. It required only accuracy and the discipline to use accuracy rather than emotion as the primary instrument. The exchange was studied in the following decades, in business schools and law schools, and political science programs, in contexts that had nothing to do with boxing or Vietnam, and everything to do with how power responds to challenge, and how challenge can be constructed to be immune to the responses that power typically deploys. In every context where it was studied, the exchange was presented not as an example of Muhammad Ali winning an argument, but as an example of how a precisely constructed factual response to an attack from institutional authority can produce consequences that the authority did not anticipate and could not manage once they began. Morley never made another public statement about Ali. Ali never mentioned Morley's name again in any public context. The exchange was complete. The questions had been asked. The answers had done their work. Everything that followed had followed from the accuracy of the questions and the inability of the institution to answer them in any way that did not ultimately confirm what the questions implied. That was all Ali had needed. That had been enough. Muhammad Ali never commented publicly on Morley's reassignment. His attorney confirmed receipt of the news and said only that Ali hoped the army would continue to think carefully about the difference between institutional authority and personal conduct. No further statement was made. No victory was claimed publicly. Privately, Ali told the people around him that the point had never been to destroy a general. The point had been to answer a question precisely and let the answer do what accurate answers do when they encounter claims that cannot withstand scrutiny. He said that was all he had done. He had answered the question. Everything else had followed from the accuracy of the answer. The exchange was studied for decades afterward in contexts that have nothing to do with boxing or Vietnam. Business schools used it to illustrate the difference between responding to an attack with emotion versus with precision. Law schools used it to examine how factual framing can dismantle a moral argument. Political science departments used it to discuss the vulnerability of institutional authority when it overextends into personal characterization. In all of these contexts, the exchange was cited not as an example of Muhammad Ali defending himself, but as an example of how a well-constructed, precise response to an attack from power can produce consequences that the attacker could not have anticipated. The lesson was not complicated, but it was rarely applied correctly because it required something that most people under attack found difficult to sustain, which was the absence of anger in the response. Ali had been called a coward by a general in front of cameras. He had not been angry in his response. He had been precise. He had been specific. He had asked questions. He had let the facts speak and trusted that the facts were sufficient. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories about Muhammad Ali and the battles he fought outside the ring that were more significant than any fight inside it. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the difference between reacting to an attack and responding to it. Leave a comment about what you think made Ali's response so effective when a general with institutional power called him a coward. And remember, Brigadier General Franklin Morley called Muhammad Ali a coward in front of cameras in Washington on a Tuesday morning. Ali took 40 minutes, made a phone call to his attorney, and produced a response so precise and so factually grounded that 11 days later, the general was gone from his position. Not because Ali was angry, because Ali was accurate. And accuracy, deployed with discipline and without emotion against a claim that cannot withstand scrutiny, is the most powerful response that exists to any attack from any direction.